I pressed my fingertips against the glass, tracing the deep gouges that cut through my bedroom window. 3 parallel lines, each about as long as my index finger, carved straight through the surface like someone had dragged a knife across it. The scratches caught the weak morning light. These hadn't been here when I went to bed. I pulled my hand back and looked at the marks, my mind racing through possibilities. A tree branch, maybe, though the nearest oak was 20 feet from the house. An animal, except nothing in Millbrook had claws that could cut through glass this cleanly. The scratches started at eye level and angled downward, like something tall had reached across and drawn its fingers down the window in one deliberate motion. My bedroom faced the backyard, where our property butted up against the Hendersons' place. Dad kept both lawns mowed short so nothing could hide in the grass between our houses. 4 generations of Millers had lived in this house, and every single one of them had learned the same lessons about staying safe in a town that wasn't quite like other places. The 6 rules had kept us alive this long. Don't go outside after dark. Don't walk alone in the woods. Don't acknowledge strangers who approach you. If you hear cows mooing, run toward the nearest building. Never accept rides from people you don't know. And if something calls your name from outside, don't answer. Simple enough until you found fresh scratches on your window and had to figure out which rule might have been broken. I grabbed yesterday's jeans from the floor and pulled them on, then headed downstairs where Mom was already moving around the kitchen. Emily Miller had this way of making coffee that filled the whole house with warmth, like she was trying to push back whatever waited outside our walls. She looked up when I walked in, her brown eyes checking my face the way mothers do when they sense something's wrong. "You're up early," she said, tucking a strand of light brown hair behind her ear. Couldn't sleep. I didn't mention the scratches. No point in worrying her until I figured out what they meant. Dad sat at the kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a steaming mug, reading yesterday's newspaper for the 3rd time. David Miller never threw anything away until he'd gotten every bit of use from it, including news that was already old. His weathered face showed the kind of lines that came from 48 years of looking over his shoulder, and his dark hair had more gray in it every month. "Sarah, you closing the diner alone tonight?" he asked without looking up from the paper. "Same as always. Make sure you lock up before sunset. Don't stay late counting the till." I poured myself coffee and nodded, though Dad had been giving me the same reminder every day for 5 years. He worried about everything, but especially about his kids being out in town when darkness started creeping in. His mother had raised him in this house after his father died young, and she drilled the rules into him so hard that he passed them down to us like family recipes. Mom set a plate of scrambled eggs in front of me, and I was halfway through eating when Michael burst through the front door. My 16-year-old brother had this way of moving like he was always running from something, all long limbs and nervous energy. His dark hair stuck up in 3 different directions, and his face was red like he'd sprinted the whole way home. "The Hendersons are gone," he said, stopping in the kitchen doorway. Dad's newspaper crinkled as his hands tightened around it. "What do you mean, gone?" "I mean gone. I rode my bike past their place on the way to school, and their front door was wide open, like hanging open all the way. I could see straight through to their backyard." Mom set down her coffee mug harder than she meant to. Maybe they went on a trip. Their car's still in the driveway, and Mrs. Henderson's garden tools are scattered all over the lawn like she just dropped them and walked away. Michael pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down, his hands shaking slightly. "I didn't see any signs of a fight or anything. It's like they just left." Dad folded the newspaper and stood up, his jaw set in that way that meant he was moving into protection mode. He walked to the front door and checked the deadbolt twice, then moved to the back door and did the same thing. The sound of locks clicking bounced through the house like a countdown. "Everyone stays home tonight," he said when he came back to the kitchen. "No exceptions." I watched him check the window locks above the sink, noting how his movements were more careful than usual. Dad had always been strict about the rules, but there was something different in his voice now, a worry that hadn't been there before. like he was remembering things he'd hoped to forget. "Dad, what if they just decided to leave town?" I asked. "Maybe they got tired of living here." He turned to look at me, and for a second I saw past his protective front to the fear underneath. "People don't just leave Millbrook in the middle of the night, Sarah. Not without a reason." The rest of the morning felt heavy, like storm clouds building overhead. Mom cleaned the kitchen 3 times, Dad checked every lock in the house twice more, and Michael kept looking out the windows like he expected to see something moving in the Hendersons' yard. I tried to focus on getting ready for work, but my thoughts kept going back to those scratches on my bedroom window. The diner sat on Main Street between the hardware store and the pharmacy, a squat brick building that had been serving coffee and hamburgers since before I was born. I'd been working there since high school, first as a waitress and now as the day manager. The job gave me something to do with my hands while my mind wandered, and it kept me connected to the pulse of the town. People talked differently over coffee than they did anywhere else, sharing worries they wouldn't voice at home. That afternoon felt different from the start. Customers came in with tight expressions and kept looking toward the windows. Conversations died when people walked past other tables, and everyone seemed to finish their meals faster than usual. The Henderson news had already spread through town like spilled water, soaking into every corner. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the flower shop next door, stopped by around 3 o'clock for her usual tea and slice of pie. She was probably 70 years old and had lived in Millbrook longer than anyone except old Mr. Garrison, who never left his house anymore. "Heard about the Hendersons," she said, settling into her regular booth by the window. I poured her tea and nodded. My brother saw their door hanging open this morning. "Third family this month?" She stirred honey into her cup with hands that trembled slightly. "The Kowalskis moved away last week, and the Brennans before that. People are getting nervous. Maybe they just found better opportunities somewhere else." Mrs. Patterson looked at me over her teacup, her pale blue eyes serious. "Honey, I've been here 68 years. I know the difference between people leaving and people disappearing. This feels like the old days, when my grandmother used to tell stories about families who broke the rules." She left without finishing her pie, which had never happened before. The afternoon went on with a steady stream of customers who ordered quickly and ate in silence. By 5 o'clock, the diner was empty except for me and the kitchen staff, who were already cleaning up for the night. I sent them home early and started the closing routine, wiping down tables and counting the register while keeping one eye on the clock. That's when I saw him. A man stood across the street in front of the pharmacy, just outside the circle of light from the street lamp. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking around, wasn't doing anything except watching the diner through the front window, watching me. I couldn't make out his features in the growing darkness, but something about his stillness made my skin crawl. People didn't stand that still unless they were waiting for something specific. I turned away to finish wiping down the counter, and when I looked back a few seconds later, he was gone. The street was empty. No sign that anyone had been there at all. I finished closing faster than usual, double-checking the locks and pulling down the security gate before hurrying toward my car. The sun had already gone down behind the mountains that surrounded our valley, and evening was starting to come across Main Street. Dad's voice carried in my head about not staying late, about getting home before darkness settled over the town. But as I drove home through streets that had grown too quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger would be back, that whatever had taken the Hendersons was still out there, watching and waiting. Something was changing in Millbrook, and I felt the worry settling over our town. The same fear that had kept my family alive for 4 generations, and the same fear that told me our luck might finally be running out. I looked up from the poster board spread across Jessica's bedroom floor and felt my stomach drop. The numbers on her alarm clock glowed red in the dim room. 7:42 p.m. "Jess, what time does the sun set?" I asked, already knowing the answer would be bad. She looked at her window where the last traces of daylight were fading behind the curtains. "Like 20 minutes ago? Maybe half an hour?" My hands went cold. I'd been here since right after school, and we'd gotten so caught up in cutting out pictures for our history project that I'd completely lost track of time. Dad would be furious, but that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was that I had to get home, and I had to do it in the dark. I have to go. I started shoving my books into my backpack, my fingers fumbling with the zipper. "Sarah, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." I wanted to explain about the rules, about why being out after dark in Millbrook wasn't like being out after dark in other places. But Jessica's family had only moved here 2 years ago, and they didn't really understand yet. They thought the old-timers were just paranoid, telling stories to scare kids into behaving. "My dad's really strict about curfew," I said instead, which wasn't exactly lying. Jessica helped me gather up the scattered photos and magazine clippings we'd been using. "Want me to ask my mom to drive you? She's just watching TV downstairs." I thought about it for about half a second. Mrs. Chen had always been nice to me, and it would get me home safely. But Dad's rules were clear. Family only after dark. No exceptions, not even for people we knew and trusted. He'd explained it to me a dozen times. At night, you couldn't be sure who was really behind the wheel. No, it's okay. I live pretty close. That was only sort of true. Jessica's house was on the north side of town, and mine was on the south side. Normally, I'd cut straight through the woods that divided Millbrook in half, but that path would take me right past the dangerous man with the rifle. Dad had pointed out his territory to me when I turned 13, marking it on my mental map as clearly as if he'd drawn red lines around it. So I'd have to go the long way, through the center of town and then down residential streets until I reached our neighborhood. If I ran most of the way, I could probably make it in 20 minutes, maybe 25. I put my backpack over my shoulder and went toward the stairs. "Thanks for letting me stay so late. I'll see you tomorrow." "Sarah, are you sure you don't want to ride?" Jessica followed me down to the front door. "It's really dark out there." That's exactly the problem, I thought, but just gave her a quick hug and stepped outside. The October air bit at my face immediately. All the warmth had drained out of the day as soon as the sun disappeared, and now the temperature was dropping fast. I pulled my jacket tighter and started walking quickly toward Main Street, my sneakers crunching on the first fallen leaves of the season. Millbrook looked different at night. During the day, it was just a small mountain town with tree-lined streets and old houses that had been there for generations. But when darkness fell, the spaces between the streetlights seemed to stretch wider, and every shadow could be hiding something that didn't belong in the normal world. I reached Main Street and broke into a jog, passing the diner where I'd start working part-time next year, the hardware store, the pharmacy. Most of the businesses were already closed, their windows dark except for the security lights that made harsh white circles on the empty sidewalks. My footsteps bounced off the storefronts too loud in the quiet evening. That's when I heard the truck engine behind me. I looked over my shoulder and saw headlights approaching slowly, much slower than normal traffic. The pickup truck was keeping pace with me, staying about 20 feet back as I jogged down the sidewalk. I couldn't see the driver through the glare of the headlights, but I could hear the engine rumbling, a deep sound that seemed to vibrate through my chest. I picked up my pace, and the truck did too. When I reached the corner where Main Street intersected with Oak Avenue, the truck pulled up beside me and the passenger window rolled down. I stopped running and looked at the driver. He was middle-aged with graying hair and a friendly face, wearing a flannel shirt that looked normal enough. His truck was older but well-maintained, with tools in the bed that suggested he was probably a contractor or handyman. Nothing about him screamed danger. "Hey there," he called out. "You shouldn't be walking alone this late. Want a ride home?" I stared at him, feeling pulled in two directions. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to say yes, to get in the warm truck and let him drive me to safety. It was getting colder by the minute, and I still had more than a mile to go. My legs were already tired from running, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. But Dad's voice was louder than my instincts, repeating in my head with the same words he'd said again and again since I was old enough to walk. Never accept rides from people you don't know, especially after dark. It doesn't matter how nice they seem or how much you need help. Family only. No, thank you, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I live really close by. The man smiled, but something about his expression made my skin crawl. Come on, it's freezing out here. I can have you home in 5 minutes. I'm fine, really. Thanks anyway. I started walking again, faster this time, and heard the truck's window roll back up. The engine sound changed, getting louder and somehow wrong, like metal grinding against metal in a way that truck engines weren't supposed to make. The noise followed me for another block before finally fading as the truck turned down a side street. I didn't look back to see which direction it went. By the time I reached the residential area, I was running full speed. The streetlights here were spaced farther apart, leaving long stretches of darkness between the pools of yellow light. Most of the houses had their curtains drawn tight, and I could see the blue glow of televisions twinkling behind some of the windows. Normal families doing normal evening things, safe inside their homes where they belonged. I was halfway through the neighborhood when I heard the mooing. It started low and distant, somewhere off to my left where the houses gave way to open fields. The sound was deeper than regular cow noises, more like a horn being blown in long, sad notes. I'd heard it before, usually on summer nights when I was safe in my bedroom with the windows closed. Dad had taught me what it meant. Something big was moving around out there, something that only pretended to be a cow. The mooing continued for maybe 30 seconds, and then it stopped. Complete silence fell over the neighborhood. No insects, no wind in the trees, no distant traffic. Even the televisions in the nearby houses seemed to have gone quiet. The sudden absence of sound was worse than any noise could have been. I remembered the rule. If you hear cows mooing, run toward the nearest building. I sprinted toward the closest house, a 2-story place with a wraparound porch and warm light spilling from the front windows. The Morrison family lived there. I'd gone to school with their daughter Katie before she graduated and moved away for college. Mr. Morrison worked at the bank, and Mrs. Morrison taught first grade at the elementary school. They were the kind of people who'd help a neighbor without asking questions. My feet pounded up their front steps just as something massive crashed into the trees behind me. The sound was like a semi-truck plowing through a forest, branches snapping and wood splintering in a continuous roar of destruction. I dove for their doorbell and pressed it frantically, looking over my shoulder at the line of trees that bordered the neighborhood. I couldn't see anything moving in the darkness, but I could hear it. Heavy footsteps, each one shaking the ground enough that I felt the vibrations through the porch floorboards. Whatever was back there was huge, and it was moving in my direction. The front door opened and Mrs. Morrison appeared in a bathrobe with curlers in her hair. "Sarah Miller? Honey, what are you doing out here?" "Please," I gasped, still catching my breath from running. "Can I come in? I know it's late, but—" Another crash from the trees, closer this time. Mrs. Morrison's face went pale, and she immediately stepped aside to let me through the door. "Of course, sweetheart. Come in. Come in." She locked the door behind me and took me to their living room, where Mr. Morrison was sitting in his recliner with a newspaper. He looked up when we walked in, his eyebrows raised in concern. "Bill, Sarah needs to stay the night," Mrs. Morrison said, not bothering to explain further. Mr. Morrison just nodded and folded his paper. "I'll call your parents and let them know you're safe." That was the thing about people who'd lived in Millbrook for a long time. They didn't ask unnecessary questions when someone showed up at their door after dark. They understood that sometimes the rules were more important than explanations. I spent the night on their couch, wrapped in a quilt that smelled like lavender and listening to the sounds from outside. Twice I heard that grinding truck engine drive past, and once something large moved through their backyard, stepping heavily enough to rattle the windows. Mrs. Morrison brought me hot chocolate and didn't comment when I asked her to keep the living room lights on. The next morning, Dad picked me up just after sunrise. His face was tight with worry, but he didn't lecture me about staying out late. Instead, he helped me into the car and drove me home in silence, both of us watching the road ahead and the fields on either side. It wasn't until we pulled into our driveway that I saw what had been left behind. Pressed deep into the soft earth of our front yard was a hoof print the size of a dinner plate. The mark was at least 3 inches deep, as if something impossibly heavy had stepped down and left its mark in the ground. The edges were perfectly clear, showing the split hoof of something that was definitely not a normal cow. Dad stared at the print for a long moment, then quietly got a shovel from the garage and filled it in with loose soil. He never mentioned it, and neither did I. But from that night on, I never doubted why we followed the rules. I kept thinking about that hoof print Dad had filled in with dirt, how perfectly formed it had been in our front yard. 2 weeks later, I was still checking the ground every morning when I left for work, looking for signs that something had visited during the night. The changes started small. Mrs. Patterson closed her flower shop early 3 days in a row, claiming she felt under the weather. The postal worker, Jim Rodriguez, mentioned that mail was piling up at certain addresses because nobody answered their doors anymore. Then Pastor Williams announced during Sunday service that the Kowalski family had decided to pursue opportunities elsewhere, which was his polite way of saying they'd packed up and left without saying goodbye to anyone. By the end of the first week, it was the Brennans and the Kowalskis. By the end of the second week, the Hendersons, the Garcias, and the Thompson family had all gone from their homes, leaving behind cars and driveways and personal belongings scattered as if they'd stepped outside for a moment and never returned. People talked about it in hushed voices at the diner, leaning across tables and glancing toward the windows before speaking. I found myself working later shifts as customers stayed over their coffee, not wanting to head home until they absolutely had to. Nobody wanted to be alone, and nobody wanted to be the first to suggest what we were all thinking, that maybe it was time to leave Millbrook altogether. "Sarah, table 4 needs their check," called Linda from behind the counter. She'd been working the morning shift for 15 years, but lately her hands shook when she poured coffee. I walked over to the booth where the Martinez family sat picking at their pancakes. Their youngest daughter, maybe 7 years old, kept turning around to look out the window behind her. "Mama, is that man still there?" she whispered. Mrs. Martinez followed her daughter's look, then quickly turned back to face the table. "Eat your breakfast, mija." I looked toward the window as I set down their check. Across the street near the corner of the pharmacy building, a figure stood perfectly still in the late afternoon shadows. He wasn't doing anything, just watching the diner the same way he had 2 weeks ago. The same way he'd been appearing all over town since then. "Thanks," Mr. Martinez said, handing me cash without looking up. "Keep the change." They left faster than usual, the little girl holding tight to her mother's hand as they hurried toward their car. I'd started asking other people about the stranger after the 3rd time I saw him. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store said she'd noticed a man standing near the woods behind her house, just watching her bedroom window from the tree line. Old Mr. Garrison claimed someone had been walking back and forth in front of his house every night for a week, always at exactly 2 a.m. But when I asked for descriptions, nothing matched up properly. Mrs. Chen said he was tall and thin, wearing a dark coat. Mr. Garrison insisted he was medium height with broad shoulders and no coat at all. Linda from the diner swore she'd seen him wearing a baseball cap, while Pastor Williams said he was definitely bareheaded when he spotted him near the church. The only detail everyone agreed on was his eyes, completely black, like someone had painted over them with ink. I wiped down the Martinez family's table and tried to focus on normal things. The register needed balancing, the coffee machine was making that grinding noise again, and we were running low on pie plates in the kitchen. Simple problems with simple solutions, nothing like trying to figure out why a stranger could look different to everyone who saw him. Michael had been having trouble sleeping for the past week, waking up in the middle of the night, convinced something was scratching at his bedroom window. Mom would find him standing in the hallway at 3 in the morning, claiming he'd heard claws dragging across the glass. When she checked, there was never anything there, but Michael's windows faced the same direction as mine had that first morning, when I'd found those deep gouges. Dad had started checking those windows every night before bed, running his hands along the frames and testing the locks twice. He never found any new scratches, but I could see the worry building in his shoulders, the way he held them higher and tighter each day. Mom had her own strange signs to deal with. Every morning when she went outside to get the newspaper, she found muddy footprints on our front porch. Not regular shoe prints, but something larger and oddly shaped, like the feet that had left them weren't quite human. She cleaned them off with the garden hose before Dad or Michael could see, but she'd mentioned it to me quietly while we washed dishes the night before. "They're getting bolder," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Whatever's out there isn't trying to hide anymore." The bell above the diner door chimed, and I looked up to see Deputy Richards walk in. Tom Richards had been working for the sheriff's department for 12 years, and he usually stopped by for coffee during his afternoon patrol. Today, his uniform looked wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Afternoon, Sarah. Coffee to go, if you don't mind." I filled a large cup and handed it to him. "Busy day?" "You could say that." He rubbed his forehead with his free hand. "Third missing persons report this week. The Hendersons' neighbors finally called it in yesterday when their newspapers started piling up." "Any idea what happened to them?" Deputy Richards took a long sip of coffee and shook his head. "Same as all the others. No signs of struggle, no indication they were planning to leave. Car's still in the driveway, dinner still on the table. It's like they just walked outside and disappeared." He paid for his coffee and went toward the door, then stopped and turned back. "Sarah, you make sure you get home before dark, okay? And tell your family to stay close to the house at night. Things are getting strange around here." After he left, I found myself checking the windows more often. The man across the street had moved to a different position, now standing near the post office instead of the pharmacy. He stayed perfectly still, and even from a distance I could feel him watching. By 5:30, I'd sent the kitchen staff home and started closing procedures alone. The diner felt too quiet without the usual chatter of customers, and every small sound seemed louder. The coffee machines bubbling, the buzz of the refrigerator, my own footsteps on the tile floor. Everything repeated in the empty space. I was wiping down the last table when I heard it start. A low, sad mooing drifted through the evening air from somewhere beyond the edge of town. The sound was deeper than normal cow calls, more drawn out and deliberate. I'd heard it before during my night running from Jessica's house, but this time it didn't stop after 30 seconds. The mooing continued, one long note blending into another, creating a continuous sound that made my skin crawl. I knew what Dad had taught me about this noise. When you heard cows that weren't really cows, you ran toward the nearest building and waited for them to move on. But I was already inside a building, and the sound wasn't moving away. If anything, it seemed to be getting closer, joined by other voices until it became a chorus of unnatural calls carrying across Millbrook. I stood frozen in the middle of the diner as the mooing surrounded the entire town and refused to stop. I stood in the middle of the diner that evening, holding my breath as the unnatural mooing finally went quiet. The sound had lasted nearly 10 minutes, carrying through every street in Millbrook before cutting off suddenly, leaving behind a quiet that felt heavier than the noise itself. 3 days later, Michael didn't come home from school. I was restocking napkin dispensers at the diner when Mom called, her voice tight with the kind of controlled panic that meant she was trying not to scare me. "Sarah, is Michael with you by any chance?" "No. Why would he be here?" I balanced the phone between my ear and shoulder while continuing to fill the metal containers. "School ended hours ago. He never came home. I've called the school and they said he left with everyone else at 3:15. That was 2 hours ago." My hands stopped moving. Michael always came straight home from school on Tuesdays because Mom made tacos, and he'd been obsessed with her homemade salsa since he was 12. He wouldn't just wander off, especially not with everything that had been happening around town. I'm coming home right now. I grabbed my jacket and keys, told Linda I had a family emergency, and drove through town faster than I should have. The October afternoon was already giving way to early evening. We had maybe an hour before full darkness. At home, I found Dad checking the garage while Mom stood in the front yard calling Michael's name. Her voice carried across the neighborhood, but no one answered. Most of the houses around us had that empty look that came from families disappearing. Windows dark even though people should have been making dinner. "Any sign of him?" I asked as I walked up the driveway. "Nothing." Dad emerged from the garage with oil stains on his hands. His bike's not here either. We spent the next 30 minutes searching everywhere Michael might reasonably go. The park where he sometimes met friends, the corner store where he bought candy with his allowance, the small arcade next to the post office. Nobody had seen him since school ended. As we regrouped in our front yard, the sun dropped behind the mountains and the first streetlights began flashing on. Dad kept checking his watch, his jaw getting tighter each time he looked at it. "We need to get inside," he said. "All of us, right now." "Dad, we haven't found him yet." I couldn't believe what he was suggesting. "We can't just give up. We follow the rules, Sarah. No exceptions. He's 16 years old and he's somewhere out there in the dark." Mom put her hand on my arm. "Your father's right. If we break the rules trying to find Michael, we might all end up missing." I looked at both of them, seeing the fear in their faces, but also seeing something else. Giving up. They were already thinking about Michael the way they thought about the Henderson family, the Brennans, the Kowalskis. People who had been there one day and gone the next, leaving nothing behind but empty houses and unanswered questions. "He's probably hiding somewhere safe," Mom continued, her voice getting smaller. "Waiting for morning. Michael knows the rules too." But even as she said it, I could hear the doubt. Michael was brave in the way that 16-year-old boys were brave, which meant he was really just reckless. If he was in trouble, he might try to handle it himself instead of finding somewhere to wait it out. That's when we heard him calling. "Sarah, help me!" His voice came from somewhere beyond our neighborhood, faint but definitely Michael. All three of us turned toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from the direction of the old Miller property where my great-grandfather used to keep livestock. The land had been in our family for decades, but we hadn't used the barn or outbuildings for anything except storage since I was little. "Sarah, please, I can't get out." That's definitely him. I was already walking toward the street, but Dad caught my arm. "We wait until morning." Dad listened to him. "He's scared and he's trapped somewhere." Michael's voice came again, more urgent this time. "Something's outside. I can hear it moving around." I pulled free from Dad's grip and went toward the house. "I'm getting a flashlight. Sarah Miller, you will not leave this property after dark." I stopped on the front porch and turned back to face him. "Then you come with me." "Absolutely not." "Fine. I'll go alone." "You will not." We stood there staring at each other while Michael's voice continued calling from the darkness. Dad had spent my entire life teaching me that the rules were more important than anything else, that breaking them meant certain death. But he'd also spent my entire life teaching me that family came first, that we protected each other no matter what. Those two lessons were fighting each other right now, and I could see the conflict in his face. "If I don't come back," I said quietly, "take Mom and leave town. Tonight." I went inside and grabbed the big flashlight from the kitchen drawer, the one Dad kept for power outages. When I came back outside, both my parents were standing in the driveway, looking helpless. 20 minutes, Dad said. "If you're not back in 20 minutes, we're calling the sheriff." "The sheriff can't help with this, and you know it." I clicked on the flashlight and started walking toward the edge of our neighborhood. Behind me, I heard Mom whisper something that might have been a prayer. Michael's voice guided me through the residential streets and into the undeveloped area where the old barn sat near the tree line. I'd played there as a kid, but that was during daylight hours, when the building looked like just another piece of family history. At night, surrounded by tall grass and the dark outline of the woods beyond, it felt like something much older and more dangerous. I was halfway across the field when the mooing started again. This time it came from multiple directions, low and sustained like the night at the diner. I stopped walking and swept the flashlight beam across the grass, looking for movement. The sound seemed to be coming from everywhere at once, rising from the earth itself. Then it stopped. Complete silence fell over the field, so total that I could hear my own breathing. I knew what the rule said. Run toward the nearest building when you hear cows that aren't really cows. But the nearest building was the barn where Michael was trapped, and I was already heading there. I started running, my feet hitting the uneven ground while the flashlight beam bounced wildly ahead of me. Michael's voice called out again, closer now, definitely coming from inside the old barn. "Sarah, is that you? Don't come in here. Something's been trying to get inside." I reached the barn door and grabbed the rusty handle. It was stuck, probably warped from years of weather. But when I put my full weight behind it, the door scraped open about 2 feet. Enough space for me to squeeze through. "Michael, where are you?" "Over here, by the back wall." "Be careful. There's stuff everywhere." I moved the flashlight beam around the inside of the barn, seeing exactly what he meant. Old farm equipment, rusted tools, and piles of rotting hay created a maze of obstacles. Michael was sitting against the far wall, his school backpack beside him, and his bike lying on its side nearby. What happened? How did you get stuck in here? I was riding home and I saw something in the woods. Something big. I came in here to hide and then the door got stuck. He pointed to deep gouges in the wooden walls around him. Those weren't there when I came in. I moved closer and saw what he meant. Fresh claw marks, each one about 8 inches long, had been carved into the barn walls at shoulder height. The wood was splintered and torn, as if something with huge claws had been testing the strength of the building. "Can you walk? Are you hurt?" "I'm okay, just scared. Sarah, there's something really big outside. I can hear it walking around the barn." As if responding to his words, heavy footsteps began walking around the building, slow, careful steps that shook dust from the ceiling with each impact. Whatever was out there was taking its time, making sure we knew it was there. "We need to go. Right now." I helped Michael to his feet and grabbed his backpack while he picked up his bike. The footsteps outside continued their circuit around the barn, but they seemed to be moving away from the door. We had maybe 30 seconds while whatever it was checked the back of the building. We squeezed through the door opening and started across the field toward home. Michael pushed his bike beside him instead of riding it, the wheels bumping over the rough ground. I kept the flashlight pointed ahead of us, but I could feel something large moving in the darkness behind us. We were almost to the edge of the residential area when a figure stepped directly into our path. The man with the black eyes stood about 20 feet ahead of us, perfectly still in the middle of the gravel road. He looked exactly the same as every other time I'd seen him. Medium height, ordinary clothes, normal face except for those completely black eyes that reflected no light at all. "Sarah Miller," he said, and his voice carried clearly across the distance between us. "The rules are breaking down. Millbrook is no longer safe for anyone." I grabbed Michael's arm and kept walking, pulling him to the left so we could go around the stranger. Dad had taught me this rule as carefully as all the others. Don't acknowledge them. Don't respond to them. Don't let them think you can see or hear them. "You have a choice," the man continued, turning to follow our movement but not stepping toward us. "Leave town immediately with your family, or stay and watch everyone you love disappear one by one." Michael looked at me with confusion. "Sarah, who is that guy? What's he talking about?" "Keep walking," I said quietly. "Don't look at him." The black-eyed man spoke once more as we passed him. The things that hunt in Millbrook are growing bolder. Soon the rules won't protect anyone. I looked at the streetlights ahead of us, at getting Michael home safely, at anything except the figure standing in the road behind us. Even after we reached the sidewalk and the man was no longer visible, I could feel him watching us go. We made it back to our house in less than 10 minutes. Dad was waiting on the front porch, and the relief on his face when he saw us both was so clear that it made my chest tight. "Thank God," Mom said from the doorway. "Come inside, both of you." As we walked up the driveway, Michael looked back toward the field where the barn sat in darkness. "Sarah, what if it comes looking for us here?" I thought about the claw marks on the barn walls, the heavy footsteps circling the building, the black-eyed strangers warning about things growing bolder. All my life, the rules had been enough to keep us safe. Follow them exactly, never make exceptions, and the supernatural things that lived around Millbrook would leave us alone. But families were disappearing anyway. People who had followed the rules for generations were vanishing from their homes, leaving behind only empty rooms and scattered belongings. Whatever agreement had once protected us was falling apart, and I didn't know if there was anything we could do to fix it. "I don't know," I told my brother as we reached the front door. "But we'll figure it out." I locked the door behind us and checked it twice, the way Dad had taught me. Outside, something large moved through our backyard, and we all pretended not to hear it. I woke to the sound of Mom making coffee downstairs, the normal routine that usually brought comfort, but today felt different. The events at the barn played through my mind as I got dressed. Michael's scared voice, the claw marks in the wooden walls, the black-eyed stranger standing in our path with his warning about the rules breaking down. When I walked into the kitchen, both my parents looked like they hadn't slept. Dad sat at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug, staring at nothing in particular. Mom moved between the counter and the stove with quick, nervous movements that told me she was trying to keep busy. "Any word from the Morrisons?" I asked, remembering how they'd helped me that night I got caught outside after dark. Dad looked up at me with an expression I'd never seen before, defeat mixed with something close to panic. "Their house is empty, Sarah. Car's gone, front door wide open, no sign of where they went." My stomach dropped. The Morrison family had saved my life 2 weeks ago, taking me in when those weird cow sounds started in the fields. Mrs. Morrison had given me hot chocolate and kept the lights on all night because she understood what lived in the darkness around Millbrook. "When did you check?" "About an hour ago. Walked over there when I realized I couldn't see any lights in their windows." Dad's voice was flat, like he was reporting facts to distance himself from what they meant. Same as all the others. Breakfast half-eaten on the table, coffee still warm in the pot. Michael came downstairs in yesterday's clothes, his hair sticking up at odd angles. He'd slept in our parents' room after what happened at the barn, curled up on the floor in a sleeping bag like he used to do during thunderstorms when he was little. "Is it over?" he asked quietly. Nobody answered because we all knew it wasn't. Whatever had been taking families from Millbrook was getting faster, more aggressive. The disappearances that had started as isolated incidents over the past month were now happening every night, sometimes multiple families at once. Dad finished his coffee and stood up. "I'm going to walk through the neighborhood, see who's left. Everyone stay here until I get back." "Dad, no." I grabbed his arm as he headed for the door. "What if you don't come back either?" "Then you take your mother and brother and drive straight to your Aunt Linda's house in Phoenix. Don't stop, don't look back, and don't ever come to Millbrook again." He left before any of us could argue, and I watched through the front window as he walked methodically from house to house, knocking on doors and waiting for responses that mostly didn't come. By the time he returned 30 minutes later, his face had the hollow look of someone who'd seen too much. "How many?" Mom asked. "Maybe 20 families left in the whole town. Everyone else is just gone." He sat down heavily at the kitchen table. "Jim Rodriguez thinks we should all meet at the town hall this afternoon, figure out what to do." The idea of gathering in one place felt dangerous, like we'd be making ourselves an easier target for whatever was hunting us. But staying alone in our individual homes wasn't working either. Not when entire families could vanish overnight without anyone noticing until it was too late. We spent the rest of the morning in a strange state of suspended waiting. Dad checked the locks on every door and window twice. Mom cleaned the kitchen 3 times, scrubbing the counters until they shined. Michael sat at the table working on homework that probably didn't matter anymore, but the routine gave him something normal to focus on. I kept thinking about Mrs. Morrison making me hot chocolate while something massive moved through their backyard, rattling the windows with its weight. She'd known exactly what was happening and what it meant, but she'd helped me anyway. Now she was gone, and I had no idea if she'd been taken suddenly like the others, or if she'd had time to be afraid. At 2 o'clock, we walked to the town hall through streets that felt like a ghost town. Most of the houses stood empty, with doors hanging open or windows broken. Cars sat abandoned in driveways, some with engines still running. The few people we passed moved quickly and avoided eye contact. Everyone focused on reaching the meeting without attracting attention. Inside the town hall, I counted maybe 40 people scattered across chairs that were normally filled with 150 residents for monthly meetings, families clustered together in small groups, parents holding their children close and speaking in whispers. Jim Rodriguez stood at the front of the room looking overwhelmed. As the postal worker, he'd been one of the first to notice the pattern of disappearances when mail started piling up at empty houses. Now he was trying to organize what was left of our community. "We need to face facts," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "Millbrook isn't safe anymore. Whatever's been taking people is getting worse, and the old rules aren't protecting us." Mrs. Chen raised her hand. "My grandmother lived here for 80 years. She always said the rules worked as long as everyone followed them exactly." "Well, they're not working now," snapped Mr. Garrison from the back row. "Half our neighbors are gone, and the rest of us are sitting here waiting to be next." The argument that followed felt familiar. The same debate we'd been having in smaller groups for weeks. Some people wanted to pack up and leave immediately. Others insisted that abandoning Millbrook would just make things worse, that running away would break whatever protection remained. A few suggested calling in outside help, though nobody could explain what we'd tell the state police about our situation. I was listening to Mrs. Patterson argue with Deputy Richards about evacuation routes when the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The overhead lights blinked once, then came back on, and conversations died away as everyone turned toward the front of the hall. The black-eyed stranger stood at the podium where Jim Rodriguez had been speaking. I hadn't seen him enter, hadn't heard footsteps or the sound of the door opening. He was simply there, wearing the same unremarkable clothes and blank face I'd seen so many times before. But this time he looked solid, real in a way he never had before. When people looked at him, they all saw the same person instead of different versions filtered through their own perceptions. His completely black eyes reflected the fluorescent lights overhead, creating an effect that was somehow more disturbing than when they'd absorbed all light like holes in his face. "Residents of Millbrook," he said, and his voice carried easily through the room without any effort to project it. "I am the guardian of this place. I have maintained the balance between your world and the other for 73 years. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The children who had been moving around in their seats sat perfectly still, as if his presence demanded complete attention. The rules you have followed were not arbitrary traditions. They were terms of a treaty, agreed upon by your ancestors and the creatures who lived here before humans arrived. In exchange for being allowed to stay, your people promised to respect certain boundaries and limitations." Mr. Garrison found his voice first. "What kind of creatures?" The guardian turned his black eyes toward the back of the room. "The beings that hunt in darkness, the ones that call from the woods, the things that leave hoof prints in soft earth and scratch marks on glass. They are the original inhabitants of this land, and they agreed to remain hidden as long as humans honored the compact." I thought about the massive hoof print Dad had filled in with dirt, the claw marks on my bedroom window, the weird mooing that had surrounded the town the night I rescued Michael. All of it had been warnings, signs that something very old and dangerous was losing patience with our presence. "The treaty has been broken," the Guardian continued. "New construction has encroached on sacred spaces. Population growth has brought people who don't understand or respect the old ways. Most importantly, too many residents have begun to view the rules as superstition rather than necessity." Mrs. Patterson leaned forward in her chair. "So they're taking people as punishment? They are reclaiming territory that was never truly yours. The disappearances will continue until the balance is restored, either through evacuation or through a new agreement." The room erupted in worried conversations as families thought about what they'd just heard. Some people started moving toward the exits, ready to pack their cars and leave Millbrook forever. Others gathered in tight groups, trying to figure out what a new agreement might look like. I stood up from my chair and walked toward the front of the room. The Guardian watched me approach with those disturbing black eyes, but he didn't move away from the podium. "What would it take?" I asked. "To restore the balance, I mean. What would a new agreement look like?" "Someone from the human community would need to serve as a permanent mediator. They would live partially in both worlds, helping to enforce new rules that acknowledge the creatures' rights to this land while protecting those humans who choose to remain." The hall fell silent again as everyone realized what he was describing. It wouldn't be a temporary job or something that could be shared among multiple people. Whoever accepted the role would be giving up their normal life completely, becoming something between human and other. "What happens to the mediator?" I asked. "They become the bridge between worlds. They see things others cannot see, hear voices others cannot hear, understand truths others cannot comprehend. It is a lonely existence, but a necessary one." I thought about my family. Dad with his constant worry about following the rules exactly. Mom cleaning muddy footprints off the porch every morning. Michael waking up from nightmares about claws scratching at his window. I thought about the Morrison family who had helped me and were now gone. About Mrs. Patterson who remembered her grandmother's stories about people who broke the rules. Everyone in this room had family members they wanted to protect. Parents who worried about their children walking to school alone. Children who were afraid to sleep in their own beds. People who loved this town because it was the only home they'd ever known. I looked back at my parents and Michael, seeing the fear in their faces, but also seeing something else. Hope that maybe there was still a way to save what was left of our community. "I'll do it," I said, turning back to the Guardian. "I'll be the mediator." "Sarah, no." Dad was on his feet immediately, moving toward the front of the room. "You don't understand what you're agreeing to." "I understand perfectly." I kept my eyes on the Guardian as I spoke. "You're asking someone to sacrifice their normal life so everyone else can have one. That's exactly what I'm offering." The Guardian looked at my face with those black eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "You are David Miller's daughter. Your family has lived here for 4 generations. You understand the importance of tradition and the importance of keeping agreements." "Yes." "And you accept the role willingly, knowing that it will change you in ways you cannot predict or control." I thought about all the families who had disappeared, about the children who would never grow up in the place their grandparents had called home. I thought about the claw marks and hoof prints and unnatural sounds that had been growing bolder every night, signs that something much worse was coming for all of us. "I accept." The Guardian nodded once, and I felt something shift in the air around us. Not a physical change, but something deeper, like the moment when you realize you've crossed a line you can never uncross. "The new compact is sealed. The creatures will return to their hidden spaces, and the humans who remain will follow updated rules that respect the shared nature of this land. Sarah Miller will serve as the Guardian's successor, maintaining the balance between both worlds for as long as she lives." As he spoke, I could see the other residents of Millbrook beginning to relax for the first time in weeks. Parents pulled their children closer, but with relief instead of fear. The heavy feeling that had been pressing down on the entire town was finally lifting. The guardian looked at me one last time. "Your training begins at sunset. Meet me at the old barn where you rescued your brother. You will learn to see the world as it truly is." Then he was gone, not fading or walking away, but simply no longer there, leaving behind only the faint scent of something wild and very old. I turned to face the room full of people who would get to go home to their families tonight, who would sleep peacefully in their own beds without worrying about what might be outside their windows. My parents and Michael were staring at me with expressions I couldn't quite understand. Pride mixed with grief, relief mixed with loss. Outside the town hall windows, the October afternoon looked exactly the same as it had an hour ago, but I could already sense something different in the shadows between buildings. A watchful presence that was no longer hostile, but wasn't entirely friendly either. The creatures were still there, would always be there, but now we had a way to coexist. I walked back to my family and took Michael's hand, squeezing it gently. "You'll be safe now," I told him. "All of you will be safe." Dad put his arm around my shoulders and I could feel him shaking slightly. "Sarah, you don't have to do this. We could all leave together, start over somewhere else." "No, we couldn't. This is our home, Dad. It's been our home for 4 generations, and it's going to stay our home." I looked around the room at the families who were already making plans to return to their normal routines. Someone has to protect that. Mom hugged me tightly, and I could feel tears on her cheek when she pressed her face against mine. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered, "and so scared." "I know, but it's going to be okay." As we left the town hall together, I could feel my new responsibilities settling around me. At sunset, I would begin learning how to navigate the space between human and other, how to speak for both sides when conflicts arose, how to maintain the delicate balance that would keep Millbrook safe. Behind us, the supernatural creatures were already going back to their hidden places, satisfied that the treaty had been renewed and their territorial rights acknowledged. Ahead of us lay the work of building a community that could thrive while respecting the old forces that shared our land. I had given up my chance at a normal life, but I had saved my family and my town. As we walked home through streets that felt peaceful for the first time in weeks, I knew I had made the right choice.